Now I would like to welcome Philip Morgan, the Harry Black Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, where he has taught since 2000. He is an authoritative voice among American historians on the history and study of the Atlantic world and slave-based Chesapeake culture. He has received too many fellowships and prizes to name. Among them is the Bancroft Prize for History for his book Slave Counterpoint, Black Culture in the 18th Century Chesapeake and Lowcountry. So it is our pleasure to have Professor Morgan with us to summarize and challenge us on this excellent program that we've all participated in. Thank you.
So it's can you all hear me? It's a great honor to deliver this final talk of this conference. I'd like to thank the organizers for their Herculean efforts. When John Coombs asked me about 18 months ago to attend this event and to do a little wrap-up, I think is what he said, it was going to be a small affair, a mini workshop, mostly about data sets. Now that modest vision has mushroomed into this gala event, and I'm wondering why I allowed myself to be talked into summarizing or trying to summarize this two-day feast. How can I possibly reflect on all we have heard and seen? I think, frankly, I need my head examining for agreeing to stand here and make this attempt. It's really an impossible task. There's been so much exciting work, it will take a while to digest. Our horizons have expanded in remarkable ways. Somebody said today, just in the last session, there's a great deal of passion and commitment amongst you all, and that's obviously true. At the same time, I'm old enough, I think, to have seen other exciting waves. I was present at the first computer revolution, the era of punch cards. I remember doing them myself. So I think I should play the role of skeptic too, a sort of a doubting Thomas. I see the value, for example, of crowdsourcing, a term bandied about yesterday, but it struck me that crowdsourcing was a bit like peer grading in a MOOC. I assume it needs a great deal of monitoring. In any case, without a doubt, slavery is the subject that keeps on giving. It's continually newsworthy. Just a few years ago, you might remember, a genealogist discovered that Michelle Obama had a great-great-great-grandmother who was a slave in South Carolina. An unknown white man impregnated the a young slave girl called Melvinia, who at the time was only 15 years of age. She gave birth to a child, then called a mulatto, Adolphus Shields, thereby beginning a 5-generation journey that would end in occupancy of the White House. So the African-American First Lady is now directly connected to the history of slavery. She's also linked to a broader pattern. Well, over half of African-Americans have a significant degree of European ancestry, and about a third of African-American males, such as Adolphus Shields, can trace their paternal lineage, their Y DNA, to a white man who impregnated a black female, most probably during slavery. That's not quite the dramatic figures reported by Annette Gordon-Reed yesterday, but she can duke this out with her colleague, Henry Louis Gates. Michelle, I take my authority from him. Anyway, but I'm just kidding. Michelle Obama's story reminds us that how close slavery is, something somebody also mentioned in the last session, how few generational leaps it takes to get back to the era of slavery, a period which encompasses the majority of American history. 3 years later, just last year, a team of genealogists at Ancestry.com broke the story that her husband, the president, the son of a black father from Kenya, as we all know, and a white mother from Kansas, and therefore apparently unlike almost all other African Americans with no apparent roots in slavery, was possibly descended on his mother's side from John Punch, one of the earliest documented slaves in North America, in his case in Virginia, who first came to notice in 1640. Mr. Punch fathered children with a white woman who passed her free status onto those children, giving rise to a family of a slightly different name, the Bunches, that ultimately gave rise to Mr. Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. Another example, then, of racial intermingling over the centuries. So the idea now is that President Barack Obama is perhaps the 11th great-grandson of one of the first enslaved Africans in America. If celebrity politics helps keep slavery in the spotlight, Hollywood is also responsible. Consider, for example, as Christy Coleman told us, the reaction to Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, a revenge fantasy movie set in the era of slavery, which has some questioning the propriety of using a still festering period of US history as a platform for a bloody, profanely comic pop entertainment, turning the horrors of slavery into pulp fiction, and with a white director throwing around the N-word in a homage to 1970s blaxploitation films. It won 4 NAACP Image Award nominations, but Spike Lee, the filmmaker, refused to see it, calling the spaghetti Western approach to slave history disrespectful. Tavis Smiley, the black talk show host, spoke of Tarantino's rape of African American history, reducing the suffering of black people to revenge and retribution. As one black moviegoer said, "I don't think that slavery is something you can make light of." But another thought the graphic violence was an excellent depiction of the horrors of slavery, and one critic has claimed that what you see in Django Unchained is moral disgust with slavery, an instinctive sympathy with the underdog. Steven Spielberg's Lincoln can be considered the different solution to the same problem. One view, unfortunately, might be that black men opposed slavery by blowing up the plantation. By contrast, white guys abolished slavery by passing a constitutional amendment. Nearly 150 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery so vividly portrayed in Lincoln has been brought to the attention of the public. In 1865, the issue was getting the votes to pass that amendment. Today's fiscal negotiations seem trivial by comparison. Yet achieving success requires the same ingredients: bargaining, bartering, bluffing, and cutting a few dubious deals. And anniversaries are, of course, a way of keeping slavery in the spotlight, too. 150 years ago, plus a few weeks, Abraham Lincoln presided over the annual White House New Year's reception and later signed the Emancipation Proclamation. As historians have been quick to point out, emancipation was a process, not a single event. It arose from many causes and was the work of many hands and feet. It began at the outset of the Civil War when slaves sought refuge behind Union lines. They indeed voted with their feet. And of course, it's been mapped so extensively in the website that Scott Nesbitt is putting together that we saw yesterday. Emancipation didn't end until December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and of course it would not end in some places until well after that time. But the Emancipation Proclamation was the crucial turning point in the story, you could say. In a sense, it embodied a double emancipation for the slaves, since it ensured that if the Union emerged victorious, slavery would perish, and for Lincoln himself, for whom it marked the abandonment of his previous assumptions about how to abolish slavery and the roles blacks would play in post-emancipation American life. One reason slavery refuses to go away is that it was no curious abnormality, no aberration, no marginal feature of America for much of its history. For hundreds of years in America, and for thousands of years before that, most people found servile labor neither embarrassing nor evil. Rather, slavery was a fundamental, acceptable, thoroughly functional institution, bearing an ancient and venerable pedigree, but also adaptable to new needs and circumstances. Prior to the 19th century, about 3 times as many Africans as Europeans crossed the Atlantic. In labor recruitment then, America was the land of the unfree, not the free. Much of the wealth of America derived from slave-produced commodities in what was the world's first system of multinational production for a mass market. Slavery underpinned not just the economies, but social, political, cultural, and ideological systems. In classical and Judeo-Christian traditions, slavery was the central paradigm for understanding the nature of liberty. You could say, in large measure, conceptions of freedom were the creations of slavery. So if slavery is located at the center of the American experience, still there are many reasons why it's still possible to marginalize it, relegate it to the sidelines, even almost completely ignore it. At one pole are those such as the notable historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who claimed in one of his most celebrated essays that when America comes to be rightly viewed, it will be seen that the slavery question is an incident. At the other extreme are those who still prefer, in Toni Morrison's words, to forget the unforgettable and to leave the unspeakable unspoken. Because of its charged and repugnant nature, for some, slavery has to be made an inconvenient truth rather than a topic of national conversation. But another reason for a failure to grasp slavery's centrality is neither scholarly disdain, Turner's remark, or induced amnesia, Toni Morrison's view of it, but the sheer profusion of new work on the subject, which is sort of truly an embarrassment of riches. The explosion of books and articles and essay collections and international symposia, research reports, digital collections, and conferences like this can be gauged in the comprehensive bibliography of slavery. In 1980, it numbered 4,000 items. Today, it's well over 40,000 items. Works on slavery cascade from the presses at more than 2,000 a year, twice the number of a decade ago. The proliferation has been so rapid, it's now hard to see the forest for the trees. It's surely impossible for any one person to keep up with this flow of information. Certainly impossible for me. So I'm going to turn to a few thoughts about data sets and websites, which was my initial challenge, my initial request. And then I'm going to single out a few approaches to the study of slavery that I see as most promising. And then I'm going to look at how slavery has been presented in public settings as best I can. And I've been scribbling away throughout this conference, and I'm going to make references to lots of things I've heard. The gold standard in terms of data sets is clearly the Voyager's website. And we've heard from the master guru himself David Eltis, about what they have achieved and what's in store. This is definitely the data set that keeps on giving, its riches continuing to flow forth. David's too modest to itemize all the latest nuggets that Voyagers keeps on producing, so let me mention a few. John Franklin held up the award-winning Slave Trade Atlas with its nearly 200 maps exploring every detail of the African slave trade. The maps linking regions in Africa and regions in the Americas are the centerpiece of that volume, and those are the ones that should be perused the most carefully. But through the Voyager's website, one can analyze everything from the names of ships, and I've heard David give some analysis of that, very interesting analysis of that, by the way, to the merchants behind the ventures, to the gender and age distribution of the captives. His Names project is a close look at those African recaptives, those liberated Africans, so-called, who were taken off slavers by anti-slaving vessels, allowing a close look at their linguistic abilities, their naming patterns, and much else. Focused, yes, only on the 19th century, but with the opportunity perhaps to backstream, as David suggests. David recently sent me a paper based on another data set he's been compiling. He's the guru of data sets. This one was of 2,000 voyages that sailed from Europe to Africa and back again without bringing any slaves at all. This is the produce trade, the trade in gold and ivory and dyes and gum arabic and commodities of all kinds. And this trade likely constituted about a quarter of all Atlantic trade from Africa. And I think we should think about all of the trade to Africa, not just that in slaves. It helps to, again, give us a sense of context and think about what the slave proportion of the trade was. He also has looked at the provisioning trade on slaving vessels, which was extraordinarily extensive. An enormous amount of food was produced in Africa to feed the slaves on those voyages. So if you're thinking about, is there any commercial agriculture in Africa, then this is the place to look, as he suggested. He's also mentioned during this conference his work on the slave trade, the particular part of the slave trade he's been working most closely on, that to Spanish America. an extremely important trade. It was the sort of stepchild of all the national imperial trades until now. It was always thought to have been pretty insignificant, but now it seems as though it's at least 2 or 3 times the size of the French traffic, perhaps even greater than the British trade, as David points out. It's rather unusual trade, of course. It was the longest lasting. The first vessel that came into Spanish territory was perhaps 1505 or so into Hispaniola, and the last, of course, was in 1867 into Cuba. So it lasted well over 350 years, much longer than any other trade. And there are a number of other distinctive features, but the other one I'll mention is, unlike other Europeans, the Spanish landed no Africans in foreign territory. So they didn't pass any of their Africans on to other places. And instead, they relied a lot, as David pointed out, on the inter-American slave trade. So what does that mean? It means that the Spanish derived captives from all African regions and from all parts of the Americas, places such as the British island of Jamaica, the Dutch island of Curacao, or the Danish island of St. Thomas, or the Brazilian ports into the Rio de Plata region. And that meant that the mix of Africans was far the greatest in Spanish America. This mention of the importance of the inter-American slave trade raises other data sets, and David is planning another one, but the one exists already on the trade in Africans among American sites after the transatlantic voyage. So this is based primarily on port records. It's a data set compiled by Greg O'Malley, as David mentioned, itemizing individual shipments carrying enslaved people between American colonies. It's primarily the British inter-American trade, but it also includes French and Spanish colonies too, and more can definitely be achieved along those lines. The resulting database documents almost 8,000 inter-American slave trading voyages. An inter-American or intercolonial slave trading voyage is the shipment between 2 American locales for which the enslaved people on board changed vessels or owners, usually both, after their arrival in the Americas. There are significant limitations to these kinds of records. They say little about the captives carried. Most often they identify enslaved peoples simply as Negroes, saying nothing about the age, the gender, or the background. As such, conclusions about gender or age-specific patterns in the intercolonial trade are certainly a lot less definitive than they are in the transatlantic African slave trade. And one last important limitation is that it's limited to seaborne voyages because officials only carefully monitored ports. Yet, as we know, and as a questioner noted yesterday, many enslaved migrants to America endured significant overland journeys to interior regions, far removed from their initial ports of arrival in the Americas. O'Malley does have a chapter that looks at this aspect of the trade in his forthcoming book, In Africans Once They Landed. But let me just give you one of the central findings of O'Malley's work, namely that 1 in 6 of all Africans disembarking from the Middle Passage to the British Caribbean, for example, quickly boarded other vessels for a final passage somewhere else in the Americas. From the North American perspective, then, for every 5 people delivered to eastern North America from Africa, another individual came via transshipment from the Caribbean. So inter-American slave movements are therefore crucial for understanding both the lived experience of the slave trade and also for any demographic analysis of the enslaved populations of the various regions. There are a number of other websites and projects exploring, I don't know quite how best it is to refer to these phenomenon. We usually say runaway slaves, fugitive slaves. Angela would prefer some other term, escapees maybe, or what was it, freedom seekers, yes. So these are based obviously on advertisements in newspapers. They're an extremely rich source about individuals, as we've seen, containing everything from clothing to appearance to idiosyncratic physical characteristics. One data set that I know of that looks at runaway slave advertisements with an emphasis on Anglophone and Francophone areas from the 1750s through the 1820s has over 26,000 individuals in it, mostly from Jamaica and Saint Domingue, it should be said, but also Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and other places. I think we can imagine in the years to come a project that looked at fugitives wherever newspapers exist, and it would be ideal if they just didn't look at the escapees, but also the many jailed captives that are mentioned in newspapers, workhouses and jails that list captured runaway slaves or fugitives, those who brought runaways into court where the captors are trying to seek mileage charges, that kind of thing. So one could think of a really omnibus project that focused on this phenomenon. Some 19th century data sets are easily available on the web that strike me as underused. I'll just mention a few of them that I played around with. How about the slave owner petitions from 1862 to 63 for Washington, D.C.? These record compensation for slaves emancipated in the capital city when in 1862 the U.S. government passed an act abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. So petitions for compensation offered to slave owners whose slaves were emancipated are contained in this database. It's got 1,000 petitioners filing claims for well over 3,000 slaves, and there's enormously rich information about names, family relationships, dollar values, and some wonderfully detailed descriptions of slaves. The owner of Perry Godwin, for example, valued him at the princely sum of $1,500 and described him as a portly, fine-looking, dark mulatto, about 5 feet 9 inches, of good address. I assume that's how he presented himself. Very intelligent, not an admission many slave owners regularly made. An upholsterer by trade, a good rough carpenter, and a very handy at any kind of work. Or how about the owner of a slave named Philip Reed, who crafted the Statue of Freedom, his owner noted, for the U.S. Capitol, the bronze classical female figure, the crowning feature of the dome of the United States Capitol. So the owner had no sense of irony in noting that his slave had crafted a Statue of Freedom, but he said of Reed, he was remarkably smart in mind and a great workman in a foundry. The online federal mortality schedules available through Ancestry.com. I mean, Ancestry.com is an amazing outfit. And they have an incredible amount of slave data that can be carefully sifted. So I just did the quick and dirty thing. I typed in slave, and I got well over 1,000 hits. The first that came up was a female slave of James Kilpatrick, described as black, with an estimate birth year of about 1755. This is in the 1860 mortality schedule. Age 105, who died in March 1860 in Clark County, Alabama. And one final suggestion of a 19th century source are the Freedmen's Bank records available online, again from Ancestry.com. You can find name, parents, brothers and sisters' names, birth dates, ages, heights, complexion, residence, occupation, name of employer, name of plantation, if resident on one, all right after the end of slavery, more or less nationwide from the existence of this bank, which lasted from 1865 to 1871. And then just finally, one last mention of an interesting resource on the web, and I'm sure everybody's been using it, namely the images, the 1,300 roughly images in the Atlantic slave trade and slave life in the Americas, a visual record compiled by Jerome Handler and Michael Chute, available on the University of Virginia Library website. Again, another impressive source for teachers and researchers. And that site has not only plantation scenes, occupations, family life, recreational activities, I'm sure you've all looked at it, but portraits of individuals. This mention of individuals is one feature of recent scholarship I'd like to single out as a noticeable trend, a kind of line of force. Glimpses of real people, not anonymous groups in concrete everyday situations, is what many readers and visitors to museums want. Consider, for example, one of the slaves featured in that website, Yarrow Mammoet. He's singular for having his portrait painted twice, once by the eminent American painter Charles Wilson Peale, and then by James Alexander Simpson, a lesser artist, 4 years later. In the latest book on Mammoet, published last year, we learn that he was an educated Muslim from Senegal, born about 1736, came on the slave ship Elijah when he was 16 years of age, that docked at Annapolis in late May 1752. His first owner was Samuel Beal, a prominent figure in early Maryland, for whom he was a so-called body servant, a waiting man. Freed in 1796, Mahmoud quickly earned enough money to buy a house in Georgetown, invest in bank stock, and make interest-bearing loans to merchants. And he signed his name in Arabic on one of his deeds of property. Far removed from Maryland, a recent article has uncovered some fascinating new features of the early life of Toussaint Louverture, the celebrated leader of the Atlantic world's only successful slave revolution in the colony of Saint-Domingue on the western third of Hispaniola, the place that we now know as Haiti. We've known for some time that he was a complicated figure, most notably that he was a free man by the mid-1770s, long before the onset of the Haitian Revolution. And as a free man, he owned and rented slaves. His family life is now much better known. His alleged royal ancestry was a myth, this article points out. He was not the grandson of a powerful king of the Aradas in present-day Benin. Toussaint's father was probably sold through Ouida, which accounted for half of all slave exports from the Bight of Benin. His father married an Alada slave in Saint-Domingue. Toussaint was born in 1743. He lived surrounded by African-born slaves, perhaps learning Fon, it's suspected. He did associate with Aladas and Najas, but during the Haitian Revolution, he persecuted followers of the Afro-Caribbean religion of Vodou, favored the French language in official settings, and employed Afro-French language Creole when dealing with social inferiors. After all, he was a Creole. And we also know that Toussaint, now we know, that he was married twice. First to a free black. This marriage took place about 1761 when he was 18 and still a slave. So the idea is probably trying to move up in the world, better himself by marrying a free woman. And they had 3 children together. That marriage broke up about 1780, and he remarried the sister-in-law of his godfather, showing a preference for people from his extended family and the African ethnic group that was associated with his parents. Now he was free and his wife a slave, where once he'd been the enslaved husband of a free woman. His 2 marriages and at least 6 surviving children help explain the extent to which he relied on his family members during the Haitian Revolution. And now we know, apparently, that his successor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was a former slave of his son-in-law. So there's an extended family web that surrounded Toussaint that makes, I think, that enriches our understanding of his actions. And during the Revolution, his land holdings grew immensely. He'd already acquired some land, not a huge amount, as a free man before the Revolution, but in all, during the Revolution, he came to own 8 plantations, rent another 23, and own a dozen plot of lands and houses. So he's, I think we now know a great deal more about his early life and how much more of a complicated figure he comes across. There are many other individuals, of course, one could feature. Olado Equiano, we all know. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, for whom there's an impressive portrait that you can see in the National Portrait Gallery if you make it over to London. The biographical project that Joe Miller mentioned yesterday. Or there is Domingos Alvarez, the African healer that Joe also mentioned yesterday. He, I think, is a perfect illustration, as is, of course, Equiano, of the complexity of identity, always multiple, shifting, fluid, and malleable. So born about 1710, Alvarez was enslaved and sent to Pernambuco in Brazil in 1730. He said in a number of these Inquisition testimonies that James Sweet uses to reconstruct his biography that he was from a village that one apparently can be identified, now gone in present-day Benin. Although others from that same region said he was from Kabu, a broader region, not necessarily from that village. In Brazil, he became a mina, a broad meta-ethnic category that was imposed on a relatively heterogeneous group. When he was shipped to Portugal, he became just simply a Negro, a Bozal, an African. But he then claimed that he was from Angola, because most Portuguese would have equated Africa with Angola. So when he went around there, he simply said that. So, I mean, I think that's a very good example that this man had no singular identity. He was from the village of Neagon. He was a Mina. He was Portuguese. He was Angolan. He was a voodoo priest. He was many things to many different people. Like anyone else, he had overlapping, shifting, situational identities. Turning inward to explore the interior of slave life in minute, often microscopic detail, is another feature of the recent scholarly literature. Slave heights have been measured, bodies weighed, bones and teeth inspected, hairstyles deconstructed. On heights, for example, African Americans in North America were taller than those in the Caribbean. By the late 18th century, the gap in height between white and black was also closing rapidly. Clothing has been dissected to describe appearance. Faunal remains sifted to explore diet. Trash, pots and pans and tobacco pipes exhumed to provide clues to material and cultural life. Graves and root cellars pried open to reveal the slaves' innermost secrets. Evidence is accumulated on everything from comparative stature to the effects of late weaning, from lead content to congenital syphilis. To get inside the slaves' minds as well as their bodies, autobiographies and memoirs have been probed, court trials plumbed, songs and folk tales dissected. The minutiae are by turns fascinating, intriguing, and mind-boggling. At the same time as there has been a turning inward, a micro-historical orientation, if you like, there has been the enlargement of scale, a turning outward that John Coombs highlighted yesterday. Let me just give a couple of examples. And the first comes from one of the things he mentioned yesterday, which is the number of Indian slaves that there were in the Chesapeake. There were sizable numbers of them, enslaved Indians, on the upper James of Virginia in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. Brett Rushworth has recently published a marvelous book on enslaved Indians in French Canada, a number of whom ended up in the French Caribbean. Christine Snyder has an excellent book on the Southeast Indian slavery system. The Indian slave trade from that region in the late 17th, early 18th century involved at least 25,000 individuals. In fact, the latest estimate I've seen about the number of enslaved Indians sold by other Indians from about 1500 to 1850 or so in the Americas, the whole of the Americas, may have involved as many as 4 million overall. So roughly 1/3 of the transatlantic slave trade in Africans. So, here's another way in which to put the African slave trade phenomenon into a broader hemispheric context by looking at the trade in and systems of slavery that involve Native Americans. The other example will come from the DAX project, which strikes me as a perfect example of this enlargement of scale. So the aim of this project, as you heard yesterday, is to look for patterns and variations and anomalies by ranging broadly, comparing sites not just within the Chesapeake, or you can certainly do that, but beyond the Chesapeake, to other parts of the South and to the Caribbean. So the notion now is, amongst some scholars, that we can talk about a greater Caribbean that might extend anywhere from Bahia in the south, at least to the Chesapeake in the north, and maybe even further. Some might want to take it to Rhode Island, that John Franklin was mentioning, to the Narragansett plantations as well. But certainly at least to the Chesapeake. And that notion, this view of an extended or greater Caribbean, is embraced by many scholars. And we learned yesterday, didn't we, that the consumption patterns of slaves look differently when placed in this large framework, as Gillian Galley noted. So, and the things that explain those differences you can't always pinpoint clearly, but I noticed, it seems to me, that access to markets, the extent of self-provisioning, the scale of diversification, and types of labor arrangements seem to be the critical issues that explain different rates of consumption patterns amongst slaves. I must say I had a wonderful time yesterday afternoon in the archaeology lab, seeing the differences in colonial wear from the Caribbean, the Chesapeake, and the Low Country, and I look forward to the reports on that wide-ranging comparison that people are engaged in at that lab. It strikes me that this is the most exciting and innovative archaeological treasure trove anywhere, and it's most impressive because of its exploitation and rigorous comparative, its explicit rather, and rigorous comparative approach across many sites. In this way, it's possible to see uniformities, it's possible to see variations. A final scholarly frontier is how to arrive at some balance between agency and structure. Perhaps part of the problem is the focus on autonomy, to which I think I've contributed in the past. How much autonomy and leeway do slaves really have? We often celebrate their little victories in cultivating their own plots, acquiring some possessions, creating a semblance of family life, and so on. This is all well and good, but in the hierarchical societies of early America, most slaves and whites probably sought safer relations of dependence that somehow did or might benefit them in both long and short terms. For most, autonomy was limited and perhaps suspect, considered dangerous and risky. Scholarship that individualizes and humanizes slaves is promising. It's valuable to break the romantic stereotypes and caricatures. But that also means confronting the darker and less heroic qualities of slavery. We cannot tell the story of slavery as wholly one of resilience and survival against all the odds, a testament to the unquenchable nature of the human spirit. These are words I've used myself. I think there's some truth to that, but the catalogue of damage and harm is too long to be swamped by the emphasis on resilience and adaptability. We need to pay attention to coercive management techniques, whippings and beatings and so on, without necessarily creating images of starving slaves being worked and raped at will. Many slaves occupied positions in the hierarchy that gave them dependent positions, eased their lot, gave them a small stake in the system. Their complicated roles need to be always kept in mind, it seems to me. Incentives, indulgences, days off, garden plots, promotions to lighter or more skilled and better rewarded work were part of the arsenal of the astute master. Simple unilinear scales that run from punishment to concessions, from resistance to accommodation, from positive to negative incentives, from subordination to autonomy, obscure the daily realities of this world. Clear-cut dichotomies cannot explain how these societies function. They do a disservice to the tragedy of oppressed peoples struggling to survive. To understand their survival is to come to terms with engagements and confrontations, concord and conflict. Mechanistic formulas really are no help, I don't think. On the presentation of slavery, museums and public places are clearly more willing to confront slavery than ever before. The recognition takes many forms. It could mean placing a plaque at the site of a sunken slave ship off Key West. It could mean constructing a slave ship, such as the Amistad, a symbol of the fight against slavery. Or it could mean, as John Franklin noted, commemorating the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, designating the 500th anniversary of the arrival of the first African slaves in the New World at Hispaniola as a Sankofa observance, or the founding of an international slavery museum in that great slave trading port, Liverpool, in 2007, which by 2010 welcomed its millionth visitor, by the way. Or then last year, the French city of Nantes opened its memorial to the abolition of slavery at a wharf on the River Loire, where the slave ships moored before they departed for Africa, with almost 2,000 panels laid into a sidewalk featuring the names of every slave ship that left that town. And that's a rather moving memorial, it seems to me. In the United States, we can point to successes and failures. Cincinnati's National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, opened in 2004, is in the former category. The National Slavery Museum, envisioned 20 years ago and scheduled to be built in Fredericksburg, Virginia, has not come to pass and looks likely never to materialize. Fortunately, the National Museum of African American History and Culture that's arising on the Mall in DC, which will open in 2015, will fill that void to some degree, although obviously the era of slavery will be only a part of its mission. Memorials of different kinds from around the Atlantic world are perhaps worth mentioning. The infamous slave ship, the Zong, the captain of whom commanded his crew to throw overboard 1/3 of his slave shipment, 132 people, and then limped into Black River, Jamaica with 208 African survivors, has a permanent stone memorial erected in 2007 close to the Zong's docking place. For many Jamaicans, 2007 was not so much the bicentenary of abolition as the 226th anniversary of the Zong's arrival. Another locale might be Goree Island, where the tourist guides hugely inflate the number of African slaves said to have left through the door of no return. And then there are the small, apparently insignificant memorials to slaves scattered in remote places. Ponder, for example, near a place I was born, there's a headstone near Morecambe Bay in Lancashire, memorializing poor Sambo, a faithful Negro who died in 1736 on arrival in England, while the headstone tells us attending his master faithfully. So the headstone says. Perhaps the most notable popular development of recent years is African Americans' willingness to engage with, rather than ignore, slavery. For too long, most black Americans preferred to avoid the subject. That stance has irrevocably changed, it seems to me. At plantations all across America, descendants of slaves are now honoring their ancestors. We heard about those at Montpelier, or we hear about those at Mount Vernon that gather, I think now annually, to pay tribute to the men and women that helped build a nation, they say, at the slave burial ground at Mount Vernon, where the graves and identities of numbers of those descendants and slaves are buried, including William Lee, George Washington's personal attendant during the Revolutionary War. As we've heard, powerful new gene technology is being enlisted in black Americans' search for their African ancestry. The aim is to find out the probable African region of origin and restore the specifics of identity lost under slavery. DNA testing has helped resolve to most people's satisfaction the paternity of Sally Hemings' children and will help in disentangling other mixed-race people's complicated ancestries. Seeking cultural as opposed to genetic roots inspires a form of heritage tourism in all the trips to the former slave castles and forts along the west coast of Africa. Many black churches in the nation have been replacing white with black figures in biblical art and stained glass. Perhaps most striking is the growing number of African Americans who collect relics of slavery, shackles, neck collars, branding irons, bills of sale, manumission papers, and the like. For these people, laying claim to, making sense of America's humiliating legacy are the prime motivations. Slavery has become a subject of pride, not shame. The slaves' survival skills, despite the restraints placed on them, are emphasized. Individuals are taking their collections to schools and colleges to make sure that the Black Holocaust, for many activists the preferred term for slavery, is never forgotten. So in the world of museum display, as we learn today, immersion, evocation, and commitment to heritage tourism has become increasingly visible and persuasive elements. Are these approaches which attempt to inject lived history into the mind and sense of the museum grower appropriate in the shadow of such a vast disaster as the Atlantic slave trade or slavery? Is there, or might there ever be, a museum that confronts the memory of Atlantic slavery in historically precise, morally appropriate, or aesthetically successful terms? I think it's almost impossible to imagine. One of the big decisions any curator of a slavery museum has to make, it seems to me, is how much trauma are you going to represent? Should pain and extreme distress be approached directly and descriptively, or in terms of a more meditative abstraction? Can horror be narrated? How much horror can be recreated? And who is it being recalled for? I do think deep contextualization, something Christy Coleman mentioned, is the key. Ask the who, what, when, why, how questions that historians always ask. Understand the circumstances in which people lived. Pay attention to name and place and function. Probe the local while always attending to the larger regional, national, imperial, oceanic, global connections. The broader diasporic conditions and circumstances that John Franklin emphasized. Explore the comparative questions. What's distinctive? What's common? Another way of supplying the right context. I personally would not get too hung up on terminology. As an academic and writer, I agree that words have power, but I'm not so sure we should be treading on dangerous ground here. But I don't think we should be so prescriptive about saying enslaved and slave. The distinction between the two, and we can only use one and not the other. I mean, I do get Angela's point, but I see the two as more interchangeable than not. Although I think I seem to be running as the only individual in the whole crowd, because everybody's constantly talking about enslaved and never mentioning slave. But for me, let me just say why I think this is not such such an important issue as seemingly others make it. For me, enslaved conjures up someone to whom something is done. It raises, for me, a level of passivity. If you're referring to the moment when somebody enslaved another person, then that's perfectly fine. But slave, considered in the right way, I think, has agency. A slave can be forceful, can be many things. A slave is not passive. He or she is an actor, does things. Slaves can be skilled, they can be managers, they can be soldiers. In some settings, they can be generals, diplomats, high-level bureaucrats. Most slaves are born into slavery. They are not enslaved, actually. So I see you all saying enslaved all the time, so perhaps I just need to get with the program, as my kids are always telling me, in terms of my technological Luddite qualities. But I offer that for those of you. I think it's not quite as cast in stone as perhaps some people would like it to be. That's my view, anyway. Anyway, to sum up, the story of slavery is clearly synonymous with that of America. Racial slavery is, after all, the grim and irrepressible theme that governs the settlement of much of the Western Hemisphere. Many claims have been made for the single key to understanding America, the one bedrock on which it all rests. Some have said the frontier, some have said the desire for personal freedom, some have said land speculation, some have said the pursuit of happiness. But there's little dispute about what is America's nightmare, its dark underside. Racial slavery is America's haunting original sin. Depriving people of liberty in a land devoted to freedom was the country's greatest atrocity, its deepest evil, a monstrous injustice, in Abraham Lincoln's words. The crime of slavery created a national wound of racial grievance that's continued to fester and that's failed to heal. The legacy of slavery is a permanent stain on the United States, a permanent stain on the Atlantic world in general. Laying its ghost to rest may never be possible. It's why the subject of slavery continues to fascinate. Every generation has to come to terms with it. Thank you. I put my foot right in it, right?
Actually, I even want to comment on last session, but to speak to this one, as a person who's on the front lines, my objective is to get the public to have emotional connection. And yes, the word slave is historically correct, just like freedom seeker, as opposed to saying fugitive or escapee or runaway. we are trying to evoke feelings of empathy and putting faces on these people, on the people who are in bondage. And just like you made a reference to some black scholars are saying, call it the Black Holocaust instead of slavery. I get that too, and I'm all for that as well. So what we're doing, or what I'm trying to do, is actually take back what was taken away from my ancestors. That's all.
Yeah, I understand that. I don't like the term Black Holocaust because I don't think the aim of enslaving people was to kill them. Obviously, it was to keep them alive and work them and exploit them, and so it's not the same thing in my view. As I say, what I don't like about enslaved is I know why you use it. I understand it, and it's to suggest a sort of that nobody embraces being a slave. That's certainly true, but I think you can get that over, I think, by suggesting that slaves are actors, that they have agency, that they can do things, that they can, for one thing, I just think it's a more felicitous use of the term. I think you can just use them interchangeably. Enslaved people is just a bit of a mouthful. A slave can be a manager. A slave can be a skilled hand, a skilled person. A slave can do all sorts of things. So I don't think it implies that you are, that you embrace your condition. And it's not just a legal technicality, I don't think, although, as I say, and I don't think my whole point was I didn't think we should get too cut up on it, but, too hung up on the term, but under the two terms.
One term.
Yeah.
But also even a Black Holocaust, I'll speak to that. You spoke about the Spanish. Actually, they were just brought over initially just to work. They worked them until they dropped dead. It was the English who actually adapted the fact, well, we need to have these people procreate, as opposed to just working them until they drop dead. So far as the Spanish slavery, it was a Holocaust.
Well, actually, I don't think that's true. Because in the Spanish territories, for example, take the Spanish Caribbean, something about which I know a little bit. If you look at the British Caribbean, the slaves largely did not reproduce in the British Caribbean. Pretty much for the whole period of slavery. So there was more births than deaths, more deaths than births amongst the slave population of the British Caribbean. So that's a naturally decreasing slave population, and the only reason it grew is because they're bringing in more Africans. Whereas the Spanish Caribbean in the 18th century and perhaps earlier has got a rate of natural increase that might be on North American terms, 2 to 3% a year, which is rather remarkable in the 18th century. It's much greater than any European population is growing. So actually, slaves on Cuba, on Puerto Rico, on the central mainland of Spanish-American territories in that greater Caribbean area, they were naturally reproducing early on. The reason that's the case is that they're not growing sugar simply, and they're on ranches, they're on small farms, they're producing diversified crops, and they're not under the real plantation regime, killing regime of sugar. So, and they give rise to a large free people of color population too, which makes the Spanish Caribbean also distinctive, much larger than the more famous group on Saint-Domingue, as big as the white population by the time of the Haitian Revolution, but actually they were much outnumbered by the free people of color in the Spanish Caribbean. So not only is the slave population reproducing, but the free people of color are reproducing rapidly in the Spanish Caribbean in 17th and 18th centuries.
What about South America, when they're initially bringing them over in South America? I'm referring back to slavery.
I think if you're thinking of a place that's where it's got a pretty harsh demographic regime, in South America it would be Brazil. It would be the sugar plantations of Brazil, but even parts of Brazil that weren't devoted to sugar had naturally reproducing slave populations actually by by the 18th century and early 19th centuries. So even there's considerable variation. I mean, sugar is the driver of naturally decreasing slave populations. It's not the only one, but it takes time, obviously, when you bring in Africans with a ratio of 2/3 male before you'll have natural reproduction. No way you're going to have that early on. But once you've got a population that's beginning to reproduce some, and if they're not engaged in the worst form of agriculture, then there's a good opportunity for them to start reproducing. They will. They do. We see it on coffee plantations. We see it on cotton plantations in the Caribbean. We see it. So it's not just the Caribbean is one big charnel house where all people are dying. It's just not the case. And I would single out the Spanish-American territories, actually, as being the most distinctive. Certainly in the Greater Caribbean, that's certainly true.
Interested in hearing your take on the public interpretation, the balance that's struck between autonomy and giving the personal stories to individual slaves and that darker side of violence and the structure around it, and how historic sites can balance that?
It's extremely difficult, I think. I mean, I just think you need to tread that tightrope, and you just can't go, you can't. It's a very delicate balance to walk. I don't think it's easy to do. I don't claim I've got any great insights on this subject. I don't think I do. I think I listened to you this afternoon, and I think you've got a very difficult job. I don't know how you do it, to be honest, because I think you're as skilled as, we're historians. We write the information that we provide, and it's up to you to interpret it as best you can. I think all I'm asking for is some degree of balance there. And I think in my own work, I may have emphasized too much, as I said, the autonomy of slaves, suggested that it wasn't as bad as it might have been. I think it's so easy to do. Because we are captivated by the examples of resilience, of adaptation, of not being oppressed. We want to find those examples. We all do. But by doing so, you can minimize the level of oppression. And I don't have any simple answers. I don't think there are any simple answers, frankly.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are no simple answers, but I think that when I'm just going to speak from me, when I hear certain things, they're really visceral to me. They create somewhat painfulness to me, or it's just a real concern that I have. And as I was sitting here, I heard you gave great information, and it was about the enslaved or the slaves. It was about my family, and the fact that I don't have information on them, except what I can, have heard or somebody passed down. I can't go to a record and find my great-grandmother's name or my great-grandfather's name or even connect those people. So sometimes I think, and I'm an educator. We can get we're very academic about it. But then, for some people, when you talk about black people, I'll talk about me as a black woman, it's much deeper than the facts. It's whether we're enslaved or slaves. My family didn't want us to be slaves. The word slave in and of itself. I started saying, enslaved. But then you gave us all this information about other countries. So to cut to the chase, America was dynamically different than many of those countries, or if you can clarify that that's not true in the way they worked with slavery. There are some countries.
I think the whole of the Western Hemisphere is deeply implicated in slavery. And
That's not what, but which one had the worst treatment?
I mean, we sometimes hear that the Spanish or the Dutch or the British or, I mean, I think these are things that are impossible to parse out, to be
that's
honest.
not exactly what, I've read on,
I don't think we should think in terms of national or imperial levels of treatment, actually. I think a lot more depends on the material conditions. In other words, I mean, obviously there's legal structures that are different. There are imperial structures that are different. They certainly should. I mean, if the availability of manumission in some places is much easier than others, so that's certainly one thing one should explore. But I think we've learned a lot about, the influence of the workplace, of the crops that are grown, and the arduousness of some versus others. So they seem to have much more impact on the material well-being, if you can term it that, of enslaved peoples.
Then my last question would be, why is there quite a bit of information out there that I have read that says, by far the United States?
Well, I think you're thinking of the harsh racial system in the United States, the fact that most people with this drop of black ancestry are considered black. So a highly polarized racial system compared to parts of the Caribbean, parts of Brazil, parts of the Americas. I think you're thinking in those terms, which in that sense, you could argue that the United States is a particularly polarizing racial society. Yes, I think that's certainly true. But I also see progress as well. So, and this is not to say that Brazil is some kind of racial haven, or the Caribbean is a racial haven. A light skin also means wealth and prosperity in some of those places too. But so in that level, yes, I think you might well argue that. But if you're arguing, for material well-being, for condition, for a naturally reproducing slave population, which is one indicator of well-being, then you would say that North America is an unusual place. It's not the only place, because I've mentioned other places too. So it's a mixed bag.
The agency question, I was going to say, now you tell me after you relied on your book. One clarification about yesterday.
What did I do? Lied?
I'm just kidding. I think I said yesterday that the two people that I worked with said that they had never encountered anyone who black person who did not have white ancestry. So we don't really know just yet what. Right. I think the figures in the Caribbean are like 30% or whatever. Yeah. So it was really their experience, not a bigger one. So,
I see.
And once we get through this, I think there might be some determination.
Figures I've heard is something like 2/3 have significant white ancestry, right? So so yes, you could be right that everybody has a little.
They were as just to clarify, they were talking about their experience as these researchers doing this medical research and so forth.
Right. But I think isn't it about 1/3 of black males, something like that, have some white ancestry? Yeah.
In light of the data and the scholarship and the public response to portrayals and interpretations we've discussed here, how will it motivate new directions in the search for data, new conceptions of history, and new models for interpretation going forward, do you think?
You're asking me?
30 seconds.
Yeah. That was a carefully constructed question that I can't possibly answer. I mean, I think the big agenda on the scholarly front is a simple one, but the Voyager's database is right at the heart of it. Is just linking precisely places in Africa to places in the Americas. That's the big agenda, I think, on the scholarly horizon. And you can do it through gene technology. You can do it through voyages. You can do it through naming. You can do it through if we start record stripping all the notarial records, all the plantation records that we have in the Americas that have ethnic data, and then start looking for connections back into Africa, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of problems, but because, as I say, identity is this slippery, malleable, shifting phenomenon. So, you've got to be very careful about what you're assuming. But nevertheless, these ethnic categories are applied, and we can use them, and we can start linking up concretely places and over time, places in Africa to places in the Americas, and back and forth. Looking for both ways, movements back and forth as well, because we know that happened a good deal as well. So if I were to throw out any one idea about what's a big research goal on the slavery front, I mean, it strikes me that's the one. I mean, there are many others, but and one shouldn't be telling other scholars what they should be doing, but it's largely, I mean, I think it's being driven by these data sets, to be honest. I think they are revolutionizing what we are able to do. We can work on a scale that we couldn't do before.
One more question.
In terms of using enslaved and slave, I use them interchangeably. But with my job interpreting, I have time constraints.
Yeah.
So explaining to a public that don't really know the difference between enslaved and enslaved, and explaining that don't have the time to, I think it's all about the time and place. Like in this forum, then it might matter, but when you're interpreting to the public, it's not necessarily the terminology per se, but the information that you're conveying is really the important part. The crux of
I think that's a very good point.
What you're doing. In terms of how to balance the harshness of the institution along with everything else, in terms of the interpretation, what we do is we use it. How we start off at Colonial Williamsburg is we start off with basically plantation work, and then from the work, how do you deal with a situation, and then when you get tired of it, what decisions do you make to alleviate and take agency of your situation, whatever the case may be, whether it's work, losing family, whatever affects an individual, and then the consequences for making those decisions, running, lifting your hand against the master, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And then going into the healing part in the family and coming together. Right. I think there's an order to it, so you can balance it and still keep under those time constraints, especially if you're, an interpreter. So I'll be happy to discuss that with anyone if they want to.
So you can use them interchangeably. That's good to hear.
Phil, all of us cannot thank you enough for that profound tour de force that was really so much a reflection and expression of your life's work. So we thank you for sharing everything you said with us today. Thank you.